G'day everyone, I'm Ebony Bennett, Deputy Director at the Australia Institute, and welcome to Pole Position, the fortnightly show where we give you the inside scoop on the latest results from the Guardian Essential Poll. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that Canberra is Ngunnawal and Ngambri country and pay my respects to elders past and present, and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded, and this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. The Australia Institute does do webinars at various days and times, so please head on over to australiainstitute.org.au to find all the upcoming webinar dates. Next week, we'll be speaking to our Chief Economist, Richard Dennis, for the launch of his new book, Big, The Role of the State in the Modern Economy. So I hope you can join us for that. Just a few quick Zoom housekeeping matters to keep things running smoothly today. If you hover over the bottom of your screen, you should be able to see a Q&A box where you can type in questions for our panel. You should also be able to upvote questions from other people and make comments on their questions as well. A reminder to please keep things civil and on topic in the chat, or we'll have to boot you out. And finally, a reminder that this is a live event and it is being recorded. You'll be able to find that up on our website later this afternoon. I want to welcome our regular guests, Katharine Murphy, Political Editor of Guardian Australia, Pete Lewis, Executive Director at Essential Media, and his colleague John Remington from Essential as well. And don't forget to head on over to Guardian Australia or to Essential for all the latest polling results and analysis. So last fortnight, we covered the fact that summer had not exactly gone as the Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, had hoped it would, and that rather than a hot-back summer of freedom, people were unable to find rat tests. There were massive lines for PCR tests. Supermarket shelves were empty and many other problems. And now Parliament is back today. And the Prime Minister wants the focus to be on the future. He wants us to be talking about the fact that they're aiming for unemployment numbers with a 3 in front of it. He talked at the National Press Club about up to $800 in bonus payments for aged care workers. And Katharine Murphy herself asked the Prime Minister about the deaths and outbreaks in aged care this year. And I do want to come back to that in just a second, but Katharine, the Prime Minister was confronted with not one, but 2 separate colleagues calling him a liar. One anonymously, who also to boot thought he was a complete psycho. And the other is his own Deputy PM, Barnaby Joyce, who's already apologised for calling him a hypocrite and a liar. One of my favourite shows, Justified, there's a character on there that says, put it like this: if you're in first grade and you beat a kid every week, you'd start to think of him as a biter. Is that how we're starting to think of the Prime Minister, Katharine?
I don't. Look, Ebony, you know I love you, but I do not want to think of the Prime Minister as a biter in any shape or form. I think that's several bridges too far. So let's step back from the abyss there and not think about him in those terms. But look, your point is absolutely sound. Your point is that it's been, a very difficult summer for the government. And then the sort of return to normal parliamentary and political business after the summer has been equally fraught for all of the reasons that you've outlined, including the free character assessments of the Prime Minister by the Deputy Prime Minister and an unnamed Cabinet Minister. And also we sort of, as we're joining you all today, obviously, Parliament is back, MPs are back, marshalling down on the front forecourt is a very large protest of people who are opposed to vaccination mandates. There is this sort of sense of the government being encircled at this point in time, that it's difficult to land a clean line or a clean thought about anything. As Eb said a minute ago, the Prime Minister's current objective is to pivot away from the pandemic, which is fraught now for the government to campaign on, and sort of reorient the debate in the economy and also set up this election debate that, we are the safe alternative. And if you change the government, that means risk. But the government is sort of having trouble just kind of steadying, pivoting, and sort of shaping the conversation in a new direction. So it's, anyway, it's sort of, it's a fascinating set of conundrums that the Prime Minister faces just at the moment.
It surely is. And Pete, I wanted to come to the polling quite shortly, but to kick us off, I guess you guys have made a real point with the Guardian Essential poll not to follow the horse race as closely, only publishing kind of quarterly where all that is up to, but that's set to change because we're much closer to the election. Do you want to just take us through before we dive into the figures, that shift?
Yeah, so maybe the horse race has now begun. Seriously, look, we took stock after the last election and the performance of all the polls and maybe providing a bit of a false lodestar, particularly for the progressive side of politics, that Labor was ahead and going to win because it was 52-48 or 51-49. When we look back over the way that we portrayed figures through the course of the last political cycle, we recognise that those numbers were never accurate, not because our weighting was out, but because there's 8 to 10% of the population that when you ask them say, I don't know, even though they're the ones that actually have to vote at the end of the day. So we made the decision, talking with Katharine and Lenore about a way to do it better, we invented what we like to call 2PP plus. And the plus is the undecided, because our insight was what we'd done by taking them out of the sample was we were actually disenfranchising the disengaged. So to put them back in the picture changes the way you look at it. And we'll go to our polling numbers in a sec. The other thing we said was that we would only release sets of data in 3-month blocks. So rather than looking, oh, it's moved 1%, what does that mean, Simon Benson? We actually sort of sit there and have a look at the movement, because there is a margin of error. There is movement of 2 to 3%, which is the static in any poll. So as you'll see today, our poll's a little bit different to where news polls been running, but that's not a bad thing. That just shows the numbers are noisy. If we want to go through, we will. But I guess to round off that conversation, so we are going to continue to report on that 8% middle, the undecided, and what that means to 2PP, because it gives us a better view of what's happening. And secondly, we are now going to release it every fortnight, but Murph and I are determined that that won't be the primary narrative. We are not going to be fixating about 1 or 2% movements week on week. We are still going to focus on the bigger contextual questions. And I guess that's the final point of this change in our approach to polling. It's allowed us, because we've had the horse race out of the front of our view, we've focused on other indicators like handling of COVID, which are much more, it is a real measure of something happening now rather than a hypothetical intention to act in a particular way in a future whose timeline is yet to be determined.
Yeah.
That all said, these are our numbers. What we have got is a pretty close race. 47 2PP plus to Labor, 46 2PP plus to the coalition, 8% undecided. So rather than saying Labor's ahead, we're in the home straight and they're pretty close and the undecided voters are going to determine the election, much as they always do. Now, if we'd put out this a week ago, or the previous cycle, Labor was a little bit further ahead, but again, within the margin of error. So I don't know if you want to go to the next few slides, you can sort of break it up a bit, but, it's easy to fall into seeing a poll like the news poll 56-44 was it, and say all over Red Rover. This says not. There is still a contest here, and incumbency is incredibly valuable. So this is the same slide on a different thing with the time frame. So you can see a week ago we would have said 50-43 with 7% don't know, and we would have been saying, oh, we're a bit like news poll, but that's the movement. Men are neck and neck, female a little bit ahead. What
is there anything that you would comment on in that one, Pete, that stuck out to you?
Well, just the narrowing on all of it. Now, so you would look at that and go, oh, that means the coalition's been doing better in the last 2 weeks. And then you look at the real world and you go, that's not what's going on. So the only point at which these numbers have a degree of resonance is then if you go to the performance of the handling of COVID, which is one more down the line, which actually says, and I think this is probably more the point, and this is probably the takeout for the audience today who are very engaged in politics and wants to know who was the phantom texter. Most people are living their life through their interaction with the coronavirus. And there has been an uptick of about 5% in people saying the government's been doing either a very good or a quite good job in the last fortnight. To me, that says that the log jams on rats and the log jams on boosters are beginning to clear. So the punter that isn't involved in politics, the heat, it's not out of the government's handling, but it's a little bit better than it was.
Katharine, what's your observation here of the latest results?
Yeah, well, look, as Pete has said, our data is different to where Newspoll and I think the Morgan survey are at the present time. I think we consistently over the last 12 months, even though we haven't been highlighting the dreaded horse race, our numbers have been slightly more favourable to the coalition than some of the other surveys. In terms of, without kind of stubbing our toe on these margin of error movements, which is half the problem, as Pete said. I mean, I think the value of having a bunch of other questions is interpretation, that we do see that uptick in, over the summer, if we step back, over the summer, obviously people's view of the government's handling of the pandemic, both federal and their state government, deteriorated over the Omicron summer. That shouldn't surprise anybody. We all had Christmas breaks disturbed in different ways by the upsurge in cases and serious infections and tragically deaths. We all know the context. So government sort of went on a slide basically over December and January. As Pete says, with sort of some of the bottlenecks that were really making people very frustrated, which is like the absence of sort of timely testing, not being able to get a booster, book in for a booster for several weeks, whatever your sort of crunch point was. Some of those things are starting to move through the system. So if we step back and think about what MPs are telling me on both sides, government MPs are of the view that they've had a kicking over the summer, an absolute kicking over the summer from the voters, but that the backlash is soft. That is, you get that consistently, not sort of withstanding the craziness of the last, as we sort of foregrounded a minute ago, whether or not the Prime Minister is or isn't a psycho or a horrible person, or whether he is or is not a hypocrite and a liar, or whatever the character assessments say. It's most people, find that annoying. It distracts, it's noise, and it distracts them from the issues that are immediately before them, which is that, am I going to stay alive and am I going to have a job? And so anyway, government MPs think that the kicking is soft. I mean, no one's triumphant. Everybody I've spoken to in the government thinks if an election was held today, they would lose it. But there is this feeling that the backlash is soft. And I have said in this forum more than once, and I have written more than once since my return to work over the summer, this is a very difficult election for Labor to win. If this is a standard election cycle where there's not massive movement either way, where people are sort of a bit near rather than definitive, this is a really difficult election for Labor to win, because a lot has got to go right for the Labor Party in quite different parts of the country. So it's certainly not impossible, but if I would rather be the coalition than Labor at this point in time, notwithstanding the fact that the government has had a very bad summer and the prelude to these parliamentary sitting weeks has been terrible. There's no other word for it.
Can I just throw one more thing in that I picked up watching the press club before the text bombs? Morrison was using this interesting formulation. It was very much a language of we're moving forward, we've done a great job. And I reckon to that kicking point, people felt really bad over summer that they were missing things. And so I think he's trying to make the way we feel about where we're up to a proxy for the way the government is. And if he can get through the next few months and we feel better about where we're going, then voting for us is voting for him. And I think that's where he's trying to get to, that we've gone through a tough couple of years. We're moving on to the other side and we're going to do this together. I think it's brazen, but I think it's potentially effective as well.
Yeah. Before we go back to the slides, Katharine, I did want to come back to your question at the press club before. I'm not sure if it was before or after the text bombs were dropped, but
immediately after his vote.
Yeah, that's right. It struck me as, one of the key policy issues that really went wrong for the government over summer. And it's not like you can just import a bunch of nurses like you can a truckload of rat tests and masks and things. Were you satisfied with the response that you got from the Prime Minister, and how much of a problem do you think the unfolding crisis in aged care? We've seen him just call in the military after ruling that out, so clearly they are worried about it.
Yes, yeah, they are worried about it. Look, was I satisfied with the answer? No. And I think this is a very live and pressing issue. The thing about the pandemic and aged care is that the pandemic hasn't sort of caused the problems in aged care. The problems were pre-existing. What the pandemic has done is accelerate the problems in a really dramatic way. Look, obviously it's complicated, it's difficult. If booster crews come through aged care facilities and residents don't want their boosters, then Scott Morrison is quite correct to say, well, what do we do? I mean, do we force people to have them? Obviously we can't do that. But the thing is, we've had a spotlight over the aged care sector for much of the last 2 years. We had a big response in the budget, last year's budget, a lot more money for the sector over a long period of time. What has been absent from the government's position at this point is a workforce strategy. And you cannot fix the problems in the caring economy without a workforce strategy. It's just not possible. So look, we need to be clear. In terms of aged care, the Commonwealth funds and regulates the aged care sector. What is happening in residential aged care is the Commonwealth's problem. It's not some rando passerby's problem. It's the Commonwealth's problem. We've had disproportionate deaths in the first wave of COVID in nursing homes because they were so ill prepared. Now, in the Omicron summer, we've had another wave of cases, and we've got this exacerbated by workforces there's not enough people basically to care for people properly. Then people are in a situation in residential aged care where they're basically having to stay in their rooms to avoid, for infection control purposes, because there aren't sufficient people present with them to be able to manage their circumstances better. So I think intriguingly at the press club, the Prime Minister did point to the government working on a workforce strategy in aged care. He did mention that in passing. And we really do need to see that, because that really is, it's not the key to all mythologies. There's lots of different problems, but without a proper workforce strategy, and that means, making caring a career that people want to consider, it's what you pay people, it's how you train them, it's their quality of work. Without that, we're not going to get a fix in a sector that we will all have some dealings with as we move through life. And demographically, we know, of course, the population's aging. This isn't a 10 years away problem. This is a now problem.
Yeah.
Pandemic has held a massive lantern over that. And yes, it was disappointing in that session to sort of, have the text bombs bomb in when there's sort of real and pressing issues that I think probably more voters care about. But I mean, that's the nature of politics, isn't it?
It is. And just reflecting on that issue of aged care, that's been a huge problem over time and identified by the Royal Commission, as you said, in that workforce section of what needs to change. Part of that, what we've been hearing about this week, is that those two kind of $400 or up to $400 payments as a bonus are just not enough for a sector that is chronically underpaid, where even the aged care providers have more or less making the case, but the government hasn't even made a submission yet to that case that the nurses union and others have brought to increase the pay for aged care workers. So yeah, a bit of a drop in the bucket there, but I'm sure they're hoping it's enough to
Though, Ebony, I thought Albo's intervention on the aged care issue was interesting this week, and I thought it was quite a nice framing. We used to call these nursing homes because there were nurses.
Yeah.
They become aged care facilities, which is almost a corporate formulation that reflects the work that really John Howard did back when he was in power, to take something that was effectively part of the public system into a marketplace. And we're kind of now trying to reverse engineer a series of safeguards around what's effectively become a deregulated marketplace. But I thought, in terms of having something that will really resonate and cut through, the idea of nurses in every nursing home is a really good place to start.
Yeah, so let's head back to our polling results here.
And can I just say, people want to play at home. There's a lot more data on our website, essentialreport.com.au, and you can play around with all these figures and get the trend lines. The one we're looking at here just sort of reinforces that everyone's feeling a little bit better than they did a couple of weeks ago, because the federal government response in each state is up. And if you go to the next slide, in most states it's up as well, except two particular states. One particular state on the other side of Australia where
Western Australia, let's be specific for people following at home.
The Stalin era endorsement of the glorious leader is dropped to only 64%. So there is a little bit of fatigue going in there. But if you look at South Australia, Queensland and New South Wales, there's been a bit of an uptick, although the story in Victoria not quite so positive for the incumbent either.
Take us through this slide on uptake of vaccines and boosters.
I might defer to the greater mind of John Remington, because he put this slide together. So I'm going to let John take us through this one.
Yeah, on the left-hand side, we've got our usual question of looking at the vaccine uptake. So that's shifted around. We've had about another 10% of people who have got the booster in the past couple of weeks. So encouraging that is continuing. So where we're sitting now is 46% of people are boosted with vaccinated with a booster dose. 43% are double vaccinated but not yet boosted. And then we've got a few small percentages who are either still on their first dose or are refusing to get vaccinated. For those people who haven't been boosted yet, what we then said was, well, what is the reason for this? And for a lot of people, as you might expect, it's just because of the slower rollout last year and the time frames that people are unable to get boosted until, I think it's 3 months in Victoria, and similar in other states now as well. Similarly, after that, 25% just haven't got around to doing it yet. So there might be a potential threat that the booster rollout slows down as people have other priorities, as lives continue and open up. What we do have down towards the bottom there is that 11% of people who have had both of their first two doses say they don't intend to get a third. Around that's around, I think, about 5% of all people, the population. So again, potential threat that the vaccine rollout could stall if people don't continue to get boosted once they have had the double dose. And that probably leads on to the next slide as well.
Well, I'll just do a quick recap. So that's only of the people who haven't yet received their third dose. That's a third who say it's too soon, since they've had their second jab, a quarter who've booked but haven't been to get it yet, about 1 in 5 who haven't got around to making an appointment, and about 1 in 10 of that smaller section of the population who don't intend to get a booster.
Exactly.
And a little bit less for everyone left over. Fully vaccinated definition. What
Yeah,
was
so,
for you, Pete?
Pete,
well, this one's not quite so difficult for me. But this is relevant because what is going to be the definition of vaccination, both in and out and across borders? But we've got a growing sense. So obviously a majority of those numbers don't take a PhD. 3 doses equals fully vaccinated in the minds of the majority now.
Not in the minds of many of the people honking around the streets of Canberra at the moment, Katharine.
That's the point, Eb. Yeah, we need to pick that up quickly, I think, because we did see a very interesting little microcosm in this vaccine or fully vaccinated definition debate yesterday. The Prime Minister announced that the international borders would reopen to tourists and travellers in a couple of weeks. The definition allowing people to enter the country is you are vaccinated is if you've had 2 jabs. The whole debate domestically, which has been led by Daniel Andrews, basically, if we sort of think about that slide that showed, if we cut to the chase on the boosters, right, there just hasn't been the urgency about getting the boosters that there was in the initial vaccination program. Obviously, people are moving through in methodical fashion, but there's just not that urgency. And the premiers are concerned about their health systems, thinking about a winter coming at us, which will have a renewed COVID season as well as a flu season, because everybody is around and about rather than being locked down for months on end. So the premiers are saying to Morrison, we really need the definition to be three jabs, because then that will focus the mind of Australians on what they need to do. It's a call to action, right? We need 3 jabs, not 2. But the Prime Minister was at pains yesterday when he announced the opening of the borders to say, no, the definition for entering the country from international visitors, that'll be 2 jabs, not 3. And even if we change the definition domestically, we're not going to change the definition for international travellers. And that, as you said a minute ago, Eb, loops in my mind to the many people who are massing on the forecourt as we speak on the webinar today. This protest has sort of been, sitting at Scott Morrison's doorstep for the last week. And the government is concerned about this leakage of votes on their right flank. There are a bunch of people outside who are literally the living embodiment of that rusting off that's happening down there at the moment. And I think at least part of the Prime Minister's considerations, as well as health advice, I'm not suggesting it's all politics at all, but obviously all of these deliberations are tested in terms of health advice. But certainly there's a feeling in the National Cabinet that Morrison is dragging his heels a bit on the 3 being the definition, because of the folks down on the forecourt.
Yeah.
Which is critical to where the Clive Palmer ads end up sending voters at the end of the day, isn't it? Like, exactly. We know what happened last time.
Yeah, it all loops back. Yep.
Pete, do you want to take us through these last couple of...
Yeah, you might need to squint, people, but again, if you're playing at home, go to essentialreport.org.au. So what we've started doing is a formulation on issues about whether an issue is going to make people more or less likely to vote for the government. And as you can see here, on most things, there's a net negative towards the government on key issues, but not overwhelmingly. So the majority are kind of in the middle there, made no difference to your voting intention. Where this gets interesting, and again, I'll defer to John, is when you look at both people that voted Liberal in 2019 who say this issue makes them less likely to vote Liberal, and people that didn't vote Liberal in 2019 who say this issue makes them more likely to vote Liberal. So if you can hold that. So what we're interested in is Liberal voters in 2019, is there an issue that's going to push you away from the government? and non-government voters, is there an issue that's going to take you closer to government? I've set up that for you beautifully, John. Do you want to make sense of what I just said?
And whilst I do talk over these numbers, I think the key ones to focus on are the second one down in that list of the COVID-19 pandemic. Overall, that's a net 13% loss in voters for the government. That's a big one. The other two are the two down the bottom with the lowest push towards the coalition. That's climate change and cost of living. So if you did vote coalition in 2019, the ones that are going to, mostly you're going to stick with where you voted. So we're looking at the differences are smaller, but these are where the negative differences are. And again, that's cost of living. So that's going to drive about 4% of coalition voters away from them. Climate change is driving around 3% away, or net away. And all the rest are coalition voters are pretty happy and would continue to vote. So those are the two big where we're seeing an actual shift. If you didn't vote for the coalition, to be honest, from these issues that we've looked at, there's nothing really which is driving you towards them at this point. So from even economic management, where they are traditionally strong, there's nothing where people are really giving a ringing endorsement of the work they've done over 4 years as a reason to vote for them next time. Yeah,
right. Pete, this one is a good one about the way people use social media. What prompted you to ask about this fortnight?
Because it's my pet project, but also because there's been over the summer an inquiry into online safety that's been running. I put up a bit about this in my Guardian column this week, which says in the fantasy world where it was a summer of freedom, this would be a really big deal now. And Morrison's been trying to build this narrative around keeping kids and women safe online for some time. People may remember at the G20, before he got poleaxed by Macron, he was going to give this global landmark speech on online safety in Australia being a world leader. And so what he's been doing over the summer, it was set up as a series, evidence from a whole bunch of victims and big photo ops. And my read was he was setting up his pitch for re-election post-COVID as keeping safe from COVID, safe from China, and safe online. Now, the interesting thing in these numbers, which I think have dropped off the screen, is that there is 2/3 to 70% support for something being done here. The question I ask in my column is this the right thing to be done? Because the work we do with the Centre for Responsible Technology is to talk about systemic change. And this is very much just a bit like the old version of crime, where you just increase the penalty on a particular crime rather than trying to understand why the crime's being committed and intervene to stop that. So people can read my column if they want. But I think there is still a huge appetite to regulate big tech. I just question whether the way this government's doing it is the right way.
We'll go very shortly to questions from the audience. I can see we've got about 850 people on the line with us today. Thank you so much for joining us. I'll come to your questions in just a second. But Katharine, I did want to touch on, Pete talked there about the Prime Minister trying to make social media a safer space for kids and women, but we've had a lot of talk in the last year about Parliament and whether or not it's a safe space for women. We know that for a lot of women, it is not. And today there was not an apology, I believe, but an acknowledgement of some of the harm caused there. Can you just tell people a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. Well, immediately before I came round to do this, I was in the chamber. I was in the House of Representatives for the statement of acknowledgement. It was an apology, Eb. There was no doubt about that. Sorrow was expressed by all of the protagonists, some with more grasp of the moment that they were in than others. I think it's fair to say. So that's a really significant thing that's happened in the Parliament at noon. If you've not been following this, the quick version is the Jenkins review, which looked into Parliament's toxic workplace culture last year. One of their key recommendations was that political leaders stand up in the Parliament and acknowledge the harm that has been perpetrated in this workplace over a long period of time and accept responsibility for not being an exemplar. as an employer for allowing this sort of combat culture of politics to determine people's lived experience in their workplaces. So the presiding officers basically read an agreed form of words on the part of everybody in the Parliament about that. Then the Prime Minister and the opposition leader, Adam Bennett from the Greens, Zali Steggall from the crossbench, Barnaby Joyce from the National Party, all stood up one after the other and made their rhetorical reparations for what has occurred in this workplace. The Prime Minister certainly said sorry. He addressed Brittany Higgins, who was one of the people sitting up in the visitors gallery with a small group of other Liberal women staffers who have done everything within their power over the last 12 months to keep this issue on the agenda. But again, the Prime Minister was talking about a problem built up over generations. Yes, of course, that's true, but really accepting responsibility for it is not talking about it as a problem built up over generations. It's a look in the mirror moment. You know, did I rise to the occasion when the occasion arrived? Anyway, but look, and Brittany Higgins was clearly overcome. At a certain point in the contributions, she became overwhelmed and left the chamber. So, you know, a huge day and moment for those women who have been incredibly brave, going against the grain in their own cultures. But, you know, words are one thing, actions are another, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, for a lot of us who are just, you know, looking on from outside, you can't even imagine kind of what a tumultuous year and a difficult year that has been. And, you know, obviously for so many women who are still there in the building, I think that would be quite a big moment. And let's hope it's the start of many, many more reforms to come. I'll go now to our questions from the audience. The first one is from Mel Smith. She asks, how does the panel think Scott Morrison will market himself leading up to the election, and will we see a different image altogether? Katharine, I might come to you first, just reflecting, if we look at the press club address as what he's trying to project, what would you say?
What would be his tagline? But no, the interesting thing about being an incumbent, and this is what's different from the last election. In the last election, Scott Morrison had been Prime Minister for, 5.5 minutes. He had the opportunity, I suppose, to construct this character of a Prime Minister that he projected very successfully to the electorate. You know, this sort of avuncular guy at the barbecue, high achiever in a baseball cap, basically was the product. When you're an incumbent, you can't conjure up a character for yourself. You are weighted by your record. Even for the disengaged voters who determine the outcome of elections in Australia, that everybody will have an impression of the Prime Minister now that has been built up over the last 3 years in government. So he doesn't have the same flexibility to sort of set a character and set a tagline for himself in this election. He's also will be weighted by the character assessments that have come from Emmanuel Macron, Barnaby Joyce, right. So, I mean, I don't need to spell that out, right? So anyway, look, what the Prime Minister sort of answering the question with reference to today's data, that data just again underscores that the pandemic is not an automatic vote winner for the government. People's concern about cost of living, again, underscores where the Prime Minister's going. He basically wants people to focus on the economy, on new job creation, on the government being a safe pair of hands. What did Pete say? We'll keep you safe from the pandemic, safe from China, safe on the economy. That's basically it, although the pandemic's on the real down low. So look, yeah, it's a bit of a long-winded answer, but all I'm saying is he has to be a prime minister in this campaign. He has to be a prime minister with a record. He has to basically appeal to people's concern about change. And by that, I mean a change of government, right? Like Anthony Albanese, the flip side of this question is Anthony Albanese, it's two words in terms of how he's trying to present himself. And those two words are safe change, right? That is entirely what the Labor leader is trying to do. What the Prime Minister is trying to do, particularly over the next few weeks and as we get into the campaign proper, is to make people, is to basically deconstruct the safe change narrative that Labor's trying to put together and to appeal to the coalition's strengths, which is security, economy. Times are serious. Anything can happen, guys. You don't want to change horses in midstream or whatever variant of that old campaign slogan we're going to get this time. That's where the Prime Minister is going to be. So it's not so much a character, which it absolutely was in 2019, but it's a set of propositions. It's a weighted set of propositions, basically, and that's where Morrison's going.
Yeah, Pete, back to my quote at the beginning, I want to be clear, I wasn't accusing the Prime Minister of biting anyone, but more to the point, if you've got the President of France and the Malcolm Turnbull, I think people can see there might be other things at play there in terms of calling the Prime Minister a liar. But when it comes out that a sitting member of your own cabinet and your Deputy Prime Minister both have the same assessment, is that now solidified as his reputation, or is there still room for him to change that?
I think Labor sees character and the connection between character and performance as really central to their proposition for safe change. If we have a Prime Minister that the majority of the population does not trust to have the character to deal with the big challenges, and that's going to affect their life, that's a pretty compelling argument for change. I don't know if any of you watched Four Corners last night. I thought Sean Nichols did a pretty good job of running a version of a focus group of swinging voters. And for those that run a lot of focus groups, nothing in there surprised me. And the two things that really struck me was the whole building of that persona of the daggy dad, but the family man who believes in God and supports the Sharks. For quite a few of those swing voters, that's locked in. And so even the attacks are coming from this sympathetic construct. And they haven't read Lech Blaine, they haven't read Sean Kelly, they haven't seen how the magician does his trick. So if you're just watching politics out of the corner of your eye, like lots of those people were in that report last night, you can see mistakes, but you're actually starting, believe it or not, with a sympathetic character. Now, I think the other interesting thing is, if you stand back, Morrison, the Bronte Sydney boys, rugger bugger who discovered the Sharks when he knifed the other guy that was trying to get Cook, versus Albo, who grew up in social housing and campaigned to save the lifelong Rabbitohs. It's almost like Morrison's appropriated Albo's real personality. Now, what strikes me is this is what Kevin Rudd did to John Howard back in 2007 when he was running Safe Change. He basically turned himself into a mini John Howard, but just a decade younger. And I remember the Labor strategist saying to me at the time, I was working with the unions, the Rights at Work campaign, you'll remember, and their proposition was, your job's to get the mob to the edge of the cliff. Our job's to convince them it's not too big a fall once they go over the edge. That's the proposition of Safe Change. Now, I don't know if there's any greater wisdom than that, but I just think that we should not underestimate, and then everyone that will go into the chat with the initials MSM, it's true. What now is going to be critical is when Morrison pulls off his baseball cap, photo ops, eating a sausage, washing hair, whether the media allows that to get to the people that are watching politics out of the corner of their eye unfiltered, when he goes and announces money in Liberal seats, whether that gets a clean run or if it's questioned with the fact they're not moving on corruption. So I do think MSM will have a really important role in this campaign because Morrison is a master of MSM. And if the MSM is allowing itself to be used, then it will create a much better opportunity for Morrison to be re-elected. Is that too harsh on MSM, Katharine?
I might just say for the people at home that Pete's talking about the mainstream media.
Oh, everyone in this forum knows what that means because that's all they tweet about. Sorry, except Chris. Sorry, Chris.
The next question that I've got is from Terence Hull, who says, will the influence of state and territory premiers and chief ministers, once the federal electioneering starts, be running hot? Will they be blamed for all the COVID stumbles, or will they appear as heroes? Where do you think that will land, Katharine?
Events, dear fellow, events. Twirling her moustache. Yeah, look, I don't know where that will, where that sort of will be at the time we're in the campaign, which is the sort of relevant marker of that. Obviously, the state and territory leaders have been much more present for Australians over the last couple of years than Scott Morrison has been. People are much more likely to have a view about their premier or chief minister than they will have had at any point in my reporting lifetime prior to the pandemic. So obviously how the state's travelling is relevant to how the federal election ultimately ends. I think that's they're all connected in a way. The states, look, as a general proposition, the state leaders have had more approval from voters throughout the pandemic than Morrison, even when Morrison was on quite high approval levels. There's always been, the states and daylight, because I think people watching how the pandemic played out and who held the power and who understood who was making the decisions, understood the states in the federation were the people with the power. So look, all the states are off their highs. Even as we said this week, even Mark McGowan only gets a 66% I love you, Mark McGowan rating. Dear God, what next? So look, it's important in terms of the political contest, in terms of the election, it is important for Morrison how the Parliamentary government is going in New South Wales. I think there's a sort of there is a concern at the moment, obviously, that among the feds and in the state government that's a bit of a vicious cycle that's not very helpful to the coalition's re-election chances. But look, it just depends what's ahead. Are we off the Omicron peak? Is there another variant around the corner? All of these things we don't yet know. So it's hard. I can do a watercolor for you, but I can't give you the definitive answer.
I did just want to ask actually both of you about, there's been a lot of talk this week about clearing the decks and clearing off the barnacles, and the Australia Institute did some polling last week in the electorates of North Sydney and Wentworth that showed that there was huge support for restoring ABC funding and reversing cuts to the ABC, long-term funding arrangements, and how important voters in those electorates think the issue that ABC is to Australian democracy. And the triennial funding agreement was up, and we've seen an announcement on that this week where they didn't continue the indexation freeze. We've got the religious discrimination bill on the books. ICAC seems to be off the agenda before the election, although the Prime Minister wasn't ruling it out. Just can you explain for people, Katharine, and then I'll come to you, Pete, with that phrase, clearing off the barnacles, like what's happening at the moment in Parliament?
Yeah. Well, look, it's sort of like you've sort of got to think about pre-election periods as, a bunch of aeronautical engineers sitting there thinking about aerodynamics. It's about how to make the plane fly at its optimal level, I guess, optimal efficiency. So anything that's dragging, anything that's applying gravity in the wrong places gets lopped off. That's the sort of concept that we're dealing with. So what the Prime Minister is trying to do in these remaining sitting weeks is sort of grind through business that is either helpful for the coalition's re-election chances or dispatch business that is unhelpful for the coalition's re-election chances. It's no more deep or meaningful than that. So yes, as Eb says, the government sort of neutralised the ABC funding issue, which is a bit of an issue in some of these contests in metropolitan areas between Liberals and the Teal independents. I think religious discrimination also plays into those contests. The Prime Minister's kind of wobbling along this line at the moment with religious discrimination, where he's sort of trying to appeal to enough of voters who may, who peel off on cultural issues, basically. So he's trying to say in those metro contests, we're going to look after gay kids. For Conservatives who think this religious discrimination bill should be an affirmative religious freedom bill as opposed to an anti-discrimination proposition, he's sort of trying not to over egg the sort of progressive element of this reform. He's been emphasising in this press conference yesterday, he said what the religious discrimination bill would do is make sure that a Sikh family trying to get a rental property would not be discriminated against. So again, the Prime Minister is always talking to cohorts of voters. You can see with that issue that religious discrimination, if they hit it right, is very good for them in parts of Western Sydney and parts of the country where there are large migrant populations.
Yeah, you look at the marriage equality map, and the electorates that voted no, a number of Labor out of suburban elections.
Suburban electorates, exactly. With a lot of voters who are devout, who have religious convictions. So again, the Prime Minister's wobbling along the path. Just if you're watching today, and we should be clear, obviously, when we're talking, if you're listening to us later, that we're talking today on Tuesday, the coalition party room has met this morning and hasn't yet endorsed the religious discrimination bill because there wasn't enough time. I think they're coming back for another session on that. So that's in the Barnacle kind of proposition. Then there's the Integrity Committee, as Eb says. The government's concerned about that or their lack of action on corruption and integrity issues being weaponised against them in some of these inner city or heartland contests. So the Prime Minister, even though he's had 3 years to bring this proposition into the Parliament, is now trying to say to us, well, of course, we're not going to go to the election without having considered this. It's just entirely unclear when this bill may actually lob. So, yeah.
Can I just also say about barnacles that the risk is that if you allow them to remain on, they become part of a broader story. So if the attack on Morrison is character and that he lies, then not delivering on election promises has extra potency because it's not just, it becomes fact-based. And if you think about what the Liberals did to Labor last time, they took all these measures that were designed at constraining tax concessions for wealthy people and turned it into higher taxes until it all came together in Labor will tax you to death. So the risk, I think, on the coalition side is all this unfinished business excites different populations but brings them into a unified narrative that the guy can't be trusted with Australia's future. So, the ABC funding, I think, is a really conscious effort just to take some heat out of that piece. Net zero is a piece of that pie as well. I
was just going to say,
though, isn't it?
The ABC funding. I mean, Katharine, I think you've hit the nail on the head there with who the religious discrimination bill is kind of aimed at. But the ABC is a totally different kind of micro constituency, as are integrity issues, although they're much more popular in a widespread manner. But that integrity, public broadcasting, climate change, those are all issues being focused on by the independent candidates who are running in some of those safer Liberal seats. Pete, how good of a job is the Prime Minister doing at threading that needle and micro broadcasting to those different audiences, do you think?
He risks the same problem that got Bill Shorten last election, which is you can no longer talk to discrete markets and not have eavesdroppers. So yes, you can very tightly micro-target on social platforms until you regulate them properly. But apart from that, you can't. So the one thing, I don't know if any of the community independents are going to win seats, but I do know that they've had a material impact on taking the heat, pardon the pun, out of the government's attacks on Labor for having a more nuanced policy. So there are some political contests where the actual end result isn't the only thing that happens. And I think that anyone on this call that's involved in community independence, you know, more power to your pen, because that is actually acting as a handbrake on the worst instincts of this government.
And I would just say that if you're interested in that ABC polling, that's available on the Australia Institute website, and the Australia Institute has also done a huge amount of research on what a strong corruption watchdog with real teeth would look like in terms of being properly resourced, independent, have broad jurisdiction, the ability to hold public hearings, many of those features in private members bill like the one put forward by Helen Haynes. But you can find all that detail on australianinstitute.org.au. And Katharine, I'll just come back to you. We're kind of, just before we wrap up, kicking off Parliament again for the year. It's actually not that many sitting weeks until the budget and then till the election. It's going to be a busy few months.
Oh yeah. Well, we're already very much in the mode of the election. I mean, you know, we can say the campaign hasn't been called, but we're well and truly campaigning. Everybody is campaigning. As you say, there's only a fraction, you know, only a handful of sitting weeks. I think the senators have an extraordinarily low number of sitting days. I think 5 or something like that, because they've got estimates as well. So look, yeah, the whole Parliament knows it's on the clock right now in terms of settling these issues before the Prime Minister visits the Governor General, and we are off after the budget on current indications. So yeah, there's definitely, look, it's going to be a hell of a year.
Yeah. And Pete, can you just remind everyone where they can find all the Guardian Essential Poll results?
Yes, I'll put it in the chat because I'm not sure if I'm giving the right address on this. I think it's essentialreport.com, but it might be .org, but I'll put it in.
Might be .org.
But it's a new site. What is it, John? It's .com.
Essentialreport.com.au.
Peter Lewis, you had one job.
I know.
Thank you very much.
Welcome to my world.
Don't forget, you can read about Katharine's analysis of the polling results up on Guardian Australia, along with Pete's column up there. As I said, head on over to australiainstitute.org.au to sign up for future poll positions and webinars. Thank you so much, everyone.
And Eb, and I think we're becoming a Guardian pod. This might end up in the August pod feed. We're in talks. So if it is, you guys will be the live audience.
Yes, might be able to catch up with it later if you had to duck out for any reason. But as always, sorry that I can't get to everyone's questions. We're really looking forward to this year. It's an election year. There's a budget very soon. So there's going to be huge issues to get stuck into. And we really appreciate your support for Pole Position. Thanks so much, everyone. Thanks, Katharine Murphy, Pete Lewis, John Remington. Thanks to the Australia Institute staff who make all of this happen. We'll see you again in a fortnight. And don't forget, next week, you can tune in to hear Richard Dennis about his new book, Big, The Role of the State in the Modern Economy. Thanks very much and take care of yourselves out there. Stay safe and we'll see you soon. Bye.